we live in a world where we can't see what's right in front of us. And I think sometimes that has to do with it being renamed. Sometimes it has to do with, long histories of mythologies that are applied to certain spectacles. And sometimes it just has to do with just simple cruelty. And I was getting frustrated that witnessing put me into what felt like an entirely reactive position. As if the containers I had were already broken. And I also felt like listening to how the news was being told and how spectacles were being narrated, that the words that were being used felt broken too.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shuchi, and I run the Transnational Literature Series here at the Booksmith, and I'm your host for tonight's reading with John Freeman and Krysten Hill. The Transnational Series focuses on stories of migration, works in translation, and the intersection of politics and literature. John and Krysten are here tonight to discuss John's latest book, Dictionary of the Undoing. In Dictionary of the Undoing, John urges us to reclaim language one word at a time. Words like the kind we use every day, I, you, love, to the ones we've perhaps become numb to, environment and vote. No word is too abstract. Of spirit, he writes, we speak of the spirit because we sense there's a part of ourselves that cannot be contained by our bodies, by our nations, by our lives, by our art. Of hope, he writes, hope is less an emotion than a field, a magnetism. Put bodies near each other and hope happens. We get to think alongside John on the page as he turns each word over and over, flows from one idea to the next, all while reminding us that true resistance requires deep engagement. This is the kind of book you revisit when you feel like you should be doing something but you don't know what, and the kind of book you read aloud to those you love. As Alexander Hemon says, one day you might be asked what you were reading in 2019, and you're going to want to say John Freeman's Dictionary of the Undoing. I'm so honored to have both John and Krysten here tonight. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you.
Hi, y'all. Hello. It's cold outside. I'm just really thankful to be here. I'm thankful to Grub Street. I'm grateful to the Brookline Booksmith. I'm grateful to John Freeman for being here. Thank you so much. I'm going to read a few poems. I feel like I picked some poems that were in conversation with John's new book because I just thought that was important to just kind of comment and be in conversation with what he is kind of writing about in the book. And so I'm just going to read a few of those, and then maybe you'll see some overlap between the things we talk about today. The first poem I'm going to read is a poem about resistance. And this isn't in the chat book. This is kind of a newish poem. I've been trying to write to this idea of hope. Hope in a difficult time. Hope that's always been difficult for people, even outside of this election. And so I'm going to read a really short one. This is a section from a longer poem. And it's called, this first section, the section I'm going to read is from a poem called I Keep an Anthology of Hope in Small Things That Grow from Uncertain Places. 1. When I was a little girl, I snuck through my fence to a vacant lot close to my house to see sunflowers eating their way out the frame of a burned out car someone scorched rather than tow. I wasn't supposed to be that far from the yard and risk my ass to see the miracle that grew through a skeleton of rust to make a broken thing useful again. If sunflowers could find their way, could flourish in the damp soil made from composted car seat and stretch for the light they needed, and if they persisted unbidden, then I wanted to make my mouth, my hands, my whole self a vehicle those sunflowers could make a home in. I'm going to read a poem made of questions because this is also kind of part in conversation with what he's talking about in his book. But these are questions that I feel like are personal to me and my own identity and just things that are overlapping in my identity. And I just feel like it's important. What started this poem is, do you know those things on the train where they ask you for your, to participate in a study, right? So there was one interesting one that I saw on the train. It was like, are you a self-identified Black woman? And I was like, what does that mean? Right? And so from this thing on a train, these questions came. Are you a self-identified Black woman? Are you eligible to partake in academia? Question your acceptance letter? Not writing the other perspective? Missing the point of the assignment? Do you get Tarantino's postmodern intention? Are you misunderstanding the function of Flannery O'Connor's Negroes? Do you wonder if your colleagues are looking for the competent color in the room? Are you the only one in the room? A performance of soft shoe? Are you inventing privilege? Are there side effects? Do you self-isolate, self-medicate, suffer from heavy sighing, eye-rolling, weight loss, friend loss, hair loss, laugh loss, self-loss, loss, silence? Did a doctor call your wounds superficial? Did a stranger spit at the sight of you in a dress you thought you wore better than a smile you wiped off with the back of your hand? Did you spit back? Did a man at a bar say you were too ugly to rape? Did you imagine what the sound your glass against his head would make? Are there problems with your resting bitch face at parties? Is your face ever really resting? Are you tired of being cute because you're trying not to be threatening? Do you wonder if white girls' tears are worth more than yours? Compare your heaviness to someone lighter. Was there ever a time when the faces of magazines pushed against the walls of your stomach when you were 13, 16, 20, and your fingers belonged to your tongue? Did you try to purge the light of those haloed faces? What did you face instead? Pieces of undigested meat? Were you ever a phase? Something he had to get out of his system? Do you remember the clamp of your white boyfriend's jaw on your thigh? Do you remember what he called you when he took you from behind? Do you cry when you think of the way he treated your love like a bad taste? Did he spit you out? Do they ask why you don't write about your joy? Why is it so hard to trust them with that? Do you wish they'd stop telling you to write around what goes through you? Wish your voice as strong and dismissive as your mama's swollen laugh? Do you cry often in this city? Do you cry at the noise of young girls swinging their lamp-lit lives against the sway of train cars, stringing their racing voices inside you? Do you cry because there are those who want to bury these breaths, smother these names, this anger, this pain, call it defensive, non-compliant, threatening, unresponsive? Do you cry at the sight of Black women with their hands up? Two more. This poem is a lot about Trayvon Martin, or for Trayvon Martin. I live in Rosendale. I have a white neighbor who lives downstairs, and this poem partially came out of an experience where she threatened to call the police on me because she thought I had a gun. And I don't think she understood how dangerous that was for me. And even now, like, I'm getting shaky thinking about it. And so to just try to have that conversation with her was important, but also it was really hard for me to manage my anger. Zombies. Someone shares a viral post that we all bleed the same color. Sometimes I cry because we have to bleed so much to belong to anywhere. I cry thinking of anyone bleeding without someone who loved them to tell them to hold on in America. I don't know where to put the blood or my anger without scaring my white neighbor who feels attacked when I can't handle her knocking at my door to complain about the incense I burn when I meditate to get free for 5 minutes. My friend says I should try to quiet my mind, that I shouldn't hold it in all the time. I can't even get through 5 minutes of trying without a white woman in my hallway coughing, waving at something imaginary, telling me I'm killing her. They after me in a dream, the zombies coming from everywhere. I've given myself away. They know where I live. I rush to barricade my house, the unhinged doors and tabletops. I can't find enough nails. I can't find a hammer. Everywhere I hide is a ripped open place despite how determined I am. They are hungry and I feel it, what it is to be snatched, pulled until I can see my legs, arms, organs coveted by so many hands. It's a reoccurring nightmare I wake from, tired, like there's a bunch of dead people's teeth making a mouth in my heart. I'm going to end on this one. Speaking of women, this poem got me in some trouble on a blog recently. A man was very angry that I wrote this poem. And I had to go through what it is to deal with that. And it's only going to get worse. And I know that. The Wounded Deer. Do you guys know the Frida Kahlo painting of a deer caught in mid-flight and she's got kind of arrows stuck? So this is after Frida Kahlo's painting, The Wounded Deer. And also this is inspired by Morgan Parker, who is always a brave voice that gives me the strength to write about what I feel is necessary to write about. The Wounded Deer, after Frida Kahlo and Morgan Parker. Hunters stay fluent in damage. They stay hungry to read your insides. You stay half woman, half deer, tired from seeding the language of your blood on terrain. You stay stalked, only this time in a clearing, wearing arrows like a crooked smile up your back. Your body stay a holy book of suffering and other things they will take later. For now, drawn to your leaping heart, 'cause it stay exposed and don't trust the cover of brush with its dying. The last time a hunter asked you, do you want to die? You were on your way to something you loved. You said, fine, but I'll take you with me. What's left but to lift your resolve, float it like a ghost that knows the wilderness like it was you in another life. When they stay after you, why they mad when you sharpen like your mama's good kitchen knife? Let them be mad then. Keep your glare armed and pointed at whatever wants you dead. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. It's so nice to read with Krysten, whose work is new to me, and I just read her chapbook today, and I was really blown away. And to hear you read these new poems, I feel really lucky to know Shuchi, to put together these pairings. I think literature festivals and often readings, they're very often people that that you get put together with, and it's really nice to meet people you didn't know that you felt like you wanted to know already. And that's how I feel listening to your poems. This book, Dictionary of the Undoing, it began with poetry. I think about a year ago, maybe a little bit longer, in the winter. I had sort of gorged myself on all the worst things that were happening, as if by watching it and going to protests and just simply observing and witnessing was enough. And in fact, it just was kind of making me crazy. And I should have known. I went to Colgate to give a reading, and a friend of mine introduced me to the author of Friday Black, and he was with a friend of his who was just cycling out of 2 years of volunteering with Black Lives Matters, and he was saying that he had finally given himself a vacation, and this is someone who had spent 20 hours a day for 2 years doing that kind of work, on top of the life that he had lived that brought him to believing in that kind of work. And I think there's a glut right now of spectacle, as if by showing enough pain that somehow we'll wake up. And I think some of what Krysten was reading about is that somehow we live in a world where we can't see what's right in front of us. And I think sometimes that has to do with it being renamed. Sometimes it has to do with, long histories of mythologies that are applied to certain spectacles. And sometimes it just has to do with just simple cruelty. And I was getting frustrated that witnessing put me into what felt like an entirely reactive position, as if the containers I had were already broken. And I also felt like listening to how the news was being told and how spectacles were being narrated, that the words that were being used felt broken too. Looking at the captions for headlines, for example. And I realized that what's in front of us has been coming for quite a long time, and it's a symptom of how this country came to be, and it's a symptom of our inability to deal with that, and the ways that we shape language around it. And I thought, what would happen if we step back and look at the language that was being used to caption some of those mythologies and narrate some of those spectacles and describe what those spectacles made us feel like, or describe what it felt like to live inside a spectacle, to be the spectacle. What would that language sound like? And so I started reading poetry again because I was stuck. I couldn't figure out how to write about this, and I pulled off the shelf this book. It was old. It was 18 years old, which is not old, but I thought it was new because it had been sent to me new by the publisher, and I just never opened it. That's one of the contraindications to being a book reviewer, is you keep books you think you'll eventually want to read. And this was J.D. McClatchy's anthology of modern American poetry, and none of the poets I'd been reading recently, Robin Cost Lewis or Claudia Rankine or Ocean Vuong or Layli Long Soldier or Solmaz Sharif or Dennis Smith, Fred Moten, Tracy K. Smith. Actually, Tracy might be in there, but I thought, this is really out of date. And I thought, no, it's just old. But, I started reading these poets, and there's so many of them he gets through. And I realized that that language is our way out of this, because language is what unites us in these kind of infernal times. And the reason why language is being vandalized and molested in plain sight is because it is the thing that connects us. Like even if we're using sign language, we have to communicate to each other. And if we cannot agree upon what the meanings of words are, there's no us. And, without encroaching on the need for there to be smaller and smaller us's within a we, I think without a we, excuse my language, we're really screwed. And so I thought, I'll try to write towards a we, and see what happens, and take myself out of this book. So I didn't use the word I. Just tried to use language from the ground up. So I'll just start with body, because I think it's something that we both write about. We only get one. That's why it has such power. Be it large or small, freckled or tinted by the sun, black, brown, or white, your body, in a world of endlessness, is the end of you. It's where you becomes me. We formulate this translation daily inside ourselves, taking in how the world sees us or addresses us, and then speaking back with that muscle in our mouth, the flex of our eyes, the tension that curls the lips without making a sound. We create ourselves in the improvisation of address, and with many and with the many things we do with our bodies, agitating our vocal cords to make a sound. Oppressive power wants to end that choice, or what to do with our bodies, how we speak with them. It wants to pulverize that agency. To do this, oppressive power has to control the body, reduce it, flatten it. You are you, it says, and I will tell you what you are, what you're meant to do. And so in difficult times, the body can begin to seem like simply a container for pain. Rising forms of tyranny want us to think this way. That means their sadism is working. It means we have begun to do the work for them, of reducing certain populations, certain bodies to spectacle. In our modern world, there are two audiences for the abuses of the body, the viewer and the person being beat, whose body is separated from them, so that its abuses entirely define them. Show this cycle of viewing often enough, and the person being beat may do the abuse for you. Our culture has become a machine tuned to spin these images, to show us black and brown bodies being abused, and women's bodies being abused, to screen pornographies of violence constantly. We consume these images and become part of them as if there isn't a different way to inhabit our bodies, as if no one right now is boiling spaghetti, or writing a postcard, or downloading a TV show, or praying, or calling out in despair, or driving along a long, broad stretch of land in a car alone, or boarding a bus, or memorizing a poem, or lifting a barbell, or holding a breast before kissing it, or laughing so hard they fall off a chair and fart, or sleeping, or weeping in grief, or weeping in anger, or shouting in anger, or putting their mouth after all these activities to a microphone and saying, "I'm here." Our job as citizens is to reprogram our culture as we hold our governments accountable to our needs. We vote and protest with our bodies. Meanwhile, we can make our culture an antidote to this poisonous cycle of images. We can choose to stop injecting ourselves with it. We can find a new lifeblood, one that is based on truth. There is violence, we can't turn away from it, but a truth that also acknowledges that no body is made for harm or better able to stand harm than another. We can make a culture that has in its bloodstream the idea that a body is also a container for joy, and one of joy's most ferocious expressions is resistance. We all know that joy is not expressed alone. Even those unbelievers amongst us find it hard among the fellowship of worshipers to deny the power of joy, of bodies next to each other, expressing it. That's why there's such tensile power in a bookstore or a library. All those bodies bent over books, bent towards joy in the Word. You can feel it on the street some days, not today, so cold, but the best of them, walking among one another, each body a moving planet of power and possible joy. As citizens, wherever we are, we have the right to the sovereignty and joy in our bodies. It means we cannot be unduly harmed, detained, beaten, spit on, maced, pinned, or choked. Any institution doing such things has already begun to lose its power. When a government begins to rely more on the instinct to coerce to stay in power, we must resist strongly, all of us. But we must also know such governments have shown how deeply they fear the power of the body. Bodies in the street marching in joy, bodies showing up to protect other bodies, bodies dancing, adorned, undressed, fucking, reading, bodies praying, bodies mobilized. Each of us may only get one body, but there's a universe of complexity and intensity, and every one. Bear down hard on bodies and they'll come together somewhere else seeking joy. It wasn't the spending contest and the missiles pointed at population centers that broke the Iron Curtain. It was the beauty of blue jeans wrapped around a body. Governments, because they tend to consolidate power in the hands of a few, behave like sociopaths and sadists, if you let them. They don't have the capacity as entities to express joy like bodies do. It's up to us to show how that's done. And in that redefinition, we take back our bodies and remember how much power they hold. I think I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
How y'all doing? Good. I'm so glad you read that.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm glad you read your poems.
There are so many like parts of this book, and so what you'll notice about the book is that there's like a lexicon, right, of like these different chapters that speak to different things, right? Would you call them chapters or sections?
I don't know. That's a good question. They're kind of I don't know. They're kind of like riffs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like if you go to some sort of musical concert and there's no one comes up and says like, "This is Autumn Fall number 7." You know, like first of all, I hate that concert. But I do like those things that just kind of unfold.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so the only thing dividing these is just the letter.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, your book, it has titles for the poems. And I always find it fascinating. Like, you know, I hadn't heard or read Zombies.
Mm-hmm.
So when you said Zombies, I was like, oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah.
Because zombies create such a huge space for what the poem can actually be. And I feel the same thing is possibly true about words. You know, like body, like you probably picture that guy on the medical wall, like, you know, one of these guys, you know, with the sort of side view of the mouth and everything. Yeah. And I feel like bodies are also incredibly powerful metaphors. Mm-hmm. You know, and I feel like we're living in unfortunately a world which is very unmetaphorical.
Yeah.
And deeply literal.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of hurts sometimes that we're getting away from the metaphor and kind of really talking about something real. Like, you know what I mean?
Were you, as a kid, interested in animals?
Oh my gosh. I feel like I write a little bit about animals sometimes and how like I would kind of take care of them to death. You know, like I feel
like Lenny.
Yeah, I was kind of like, what is that thing on Looney Tunes? Y'all remember she was kind of that character that just kind of smothered things and like hugged something to death until, like, I feel like I loved animals and I was always really empathetic with animals. It's amazing to me sometimes the metaphors that come out of talking about animals in poetry and writing, because in a way, like, as we're growing up, we're learning to try on kindness.
Yeah.
Sometimes
that's such a nice way to look at it.
It's
better than trying on cruelty.
Well, and that's also a different thing. We also learn how to try on cruelty, unfortunately, when we're young, maybe with our pets. I'm not trying to be like a psycho when I say that, but like I feel like I have a few poems about that, like what it is to try on things when you're young, like try on emotions. And we see that in our classrooms.
Yeah.
Right? This idea of students trying on feelings.
Did you try in like narratives too? Because when you were reading the poem, the first one you read about sunflowers coming out of that neighborhood, was that sort of based on where you grew up?
Yeah, I grew up in the inner city. I grew up in inner city Kansas City, Missouri, and I had a lot of vacant lots around me, and it didn't mean like a deficit. It wasn't an ugly thing. People think vacant lots are ugly. But they can also be like these surprising places for like adventure, especially as a kid.
It's very strange when you go back and all the vacant lots are not there anymore.
Yeah.
Because that's where we did all of our worst things. We're like, hey, there's a big ditch. Let's jump our bikes over it, even though we could totally kill ourselves.
But there are these places of discovery. And also these places we were told not to go because they were dangerous. But they opened us up to these moments of good stuff.
Yeah, I'm bringing up animals because I think there's a wildness in us and people and humans that frightens, I think, just all kinds of normal structures.
Yeah.
And I think we're more alike in our wildness if, and I'm not trying to say, oh, we all bleed the same color. That's fucking that's stupid. But I think the wildness is one thing that gets tamed out of us pretty quickly.
Yeah. And there are spaces that tame that out of us, unfortunately. I don't know. Like, I was like, when I came to grad school, I was a little bit worried about how much of myself I would lose in the process. Or even as a teacher after grad school, I worry about how much I've lost of myself, but also how much I've gained of myself as well.
Do you have to learn how to use all the language of academia and papers and certain forums? I'm thinking about this because I just read Janine Capot-Cruset's book of essays, which I will not remember the title of. It's her third book, but she was the first in her family to go to university. She went to Cornell, arrives there. She's got a great, amazing test scores, but she's never been in classes where she's gendered and intersectionality. And so she like calls her grandmother and says, I'm totally going to fail. What's wrong with this? But she masters it. And now she works in academia, and she kind of just basically code switches. Like she writes about this in her voice, and then while she's in academia, she uses the language.
Absolutely. I don't think like, for me, because I teach at UMass Boston. So a lot of my students are students of color, first generation, immigrant students. And so I do a little bit of code switching, but a lot of times I can just be myself with them. It feels really
great.
Good. But in a lot of ways also I'm visible in terms of a body. I'm a Black female professor who's also having to navigate what it is to be a Black female professor and be very visible in front of people. And that kind of performance can be really exhausting as well. Yeah.
Wow. Have you ever written about it
I mean, some of these poems have been a way into that, like the question poem.
The Plath poem is great too.
The Plath poem has been a way into that.
I kind of went off Plath recently. I don't know. I like the bell jar, but I was reading Daddy in class to my students, and I stopped in the middle. I was like, okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going to take a break from this poem.
Why?
Because I was reading it trying to use it as an example of tone.
Yeah.
I was reading it next to Robert Hayden's poem about this quiet, dark.
I love that.
It's a heartbreaking poem. It's like his dad's stoking the furnace.
From the blue, black cold.
Yeah.
Right?
What did I know of love's lonely offices?
Yeah.
And it's just a beautiful poem about kind of how love often happens when you're not looking.
Yeah.
And, the Plath poem is so, it's borrowing the sort of language of the Holocaust to deal with, I thought, sort of father issues.
Yeah.
And using that really uncomfortable rhyme scheme to like kind of create this quiet. And I just felt kind of bullied into this position of sympathy where I didn't know exactly what I was feeling sympathy for. Whereas the other poem just creates a space where love is possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, Robert Hayden is kind of magical in that way.
God, he is.
It's really unexpected. I mean, Plath can be really unexpected in that way. I don't know.
Hayden was in that anthology I mentioned, the McClatchy. I had never read Hayden.
Yeah.
I somehow got through 43 years of my life without reading Robert Hayden, and I read that poem and I thought, it was like, I know this debut poet, Robert Hayden.
What is it?
And it's amazing how you can walk into a bookstore and if you've never read someone, it's as if they're a debut writer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that, to me, something it made me fall in love with.
Sometimes I feel so unread. You know what I mean? Like I don't know all these people that I'm supposed to know. But that's kind of the magic about being like involved in like literacy, is that you stumble upon people who have been around forever.
What was your last sort of kind of collision? Where you where someone gave you something and it hits you almost like with a bodily force.
Oh my God. I mean, every time I encounter James Baldwin, even though I've been giving him for a long time, every time someone gives me an essay that maybe I hadn't encountered, even though I've encountered him for a long time, I feel like I'm dead now. Right? Right? Like he seems like pretty timeless, especially in times like these.
There's that disarming vulnerability in his voice.
Yeah. He knows himself.
And he's thinking in front of you.
Yes. And he's working through things.
Which I think is so, essential in an essay.
Yeah.
So with these essays, I didn't actually, I'm not comparing myself to Baldwin here. As with James Baldwin, who...
Let me tell you.
Yeah. But I just basically had, I tried to write them in one sitting.
Yeah.
And without a definition of the word in front of me.
I wondered what this process was like for you.
So I just wanted to see what came out when I thought, like, what exactly is a citizen?
Yeah.
Or what is decency? And so I would sit and I'd read, poetry for an hour, and then as soon as like there was a kind of snag, like it's almost like lighting a fire. Like if you read enough poetry early in the morning, it creates this thing, and then I would sit down and write a word.
Did you give yourself a word limit?
No, but usually they ended up between like 1,000 and 2,500 words.
I think it's a great writing exercise, this lexicon that you've created.
Well, I've given it to students, and I got it from this guy Brian Blanchfield, who I don't know, but he won a Whiting for this book called Proxies, and it's a series of essays about words. And I met him at one of these, you live in New York, and everyone needs bodies at like official functions, and so I turned up at the Whiting lunch, and I was like, talking to him, and he had written a series of essays that were about words and emotions. I mean, just basically like this, but not related to citizenship per se.
Right.
And they were incredible, and it's just simply he was trying to open up his mind.
Yeah.
As much as possible, and then seeing what sort of imprint came out. And so that's where I got part of the idea for these essays.
What words didn't make the cut?
That's a good question. There were a couple words, like, there were words I thought I should do, and then I steered away from them. Because I citizen was really important, body was really important, fairness, love, teachers, women, which felt really weird to be like, oh, let me define what women are. But in the context of this book, it's not necessarily a definition. By that point, each letter basically uses the previous letter. So by W, it's using 23 other previous letters, and so it's creating a lexicon of political, ethical engagement. And I sort of began with women, realizing that women have been an essential part of every civic social justice movement ever, and thinking about why that's so. But as for words I left out, they tended to be more personal and intimate words.
Yeah.
Like regret.
Yeah.
Like I know our society should regret some things.
Always.
Like maybe something that's happening right in front of us right now is a way to get rid of that regret. But I don't think I think it's very hard for institutions to regret. Because and I think regret is close to shame, but it's not shame.
Yeah.
And shame would have been another one. I think shame, we have cultural forms of shame, and shame is projected onto certain populations more than others, and it's applied at women much harder than it is to men. Although, if you grew up, I don't know, I think it's very difficult to grow up with any kind of religious background without getting the vines of shame.
Active shame.
You're like trying to get the kudzu off you, running towards sex, and they're like, no, we will make sure you hate yourself afterwards. So yeah, regret and shame, I think, are really big parts of interpersonal relationships. But I don't know. I felt weird, like injecting them into civic discourse.
Oh, absolutely.
But I don't know.
I feel like this lexicon is growing. Like even when I was reading the book, I was like, what would my lexicon look like? Which is a good thing.
That would be the best thing ever, is if suddenly there were all sorts of other dictionaries.
I love it.
Like Samuel Johnson made the first serious big English dictionary, but like afterwards there were other ones.
Yeah.
And this is meant to be, I gave this as an exercise to my undergrads last summer, and they came up with the most amazing dictionaries, and some of them were narrative based. One was done by a trans student, and so each thing was kind of an essential definition.
I love it.
And it was just, I thought, God, like imagine what the dictionary shelf would be, the best shelf. I mean, it's already a pretty good shelf because you have all sorts of words there. But, but I think a dictionary shelf that's full of dictionaries and poems, dictionaries and like, quasi-narratives, dictionaries of fables.
I like it.
And I think, do you ever? One of my friends is a writer from Somalia, and whenever I ask him a question, he tells me a story. And I'm like, that is like a client. And he's like close to 80, and he's of a certain generation, and that's like his way of interacting. It's like you ask Nuruddin like to do something, and he's like, all right. So anyway, like 20 years ago, and then you're in for that's like his definition.
But stories are good.
Yes.
Stories define, you know?
But I think, we were talking about mythologies.
Absolutely.
And I think a mythology is a definition.
Absolutely. It tells us a lot about where we come from. I was telling him backstage that one of my assignments is to talk about how my students investigate their own creation myths. Like, what's a story that has been really formative to you in terms of, like, structuring the way you retell your life? And it's really interesting. They either come up with things that are biblical, which this great, or, like, stuff that they've been just reinforced generationally, like stories that have been passed down for generations in their family. But they're really informative to the way that they view identity.
I had students, I teach a class at NYU, and we're right now currently reading Arturo's Island by Elsa Ferranti, which is recently retranslated by Ann Goldstein, the Ferranti translator. And Ferranti got her pseudonym from Ferranti, who is this mid-century Italian writer who wrote about 5 novels, a couple books of poems, one a decade. One of them, The Story, I think, sold 1 million copies, but she never really took off here. And this book is set on an island. It's a boy, he's 14, telling the story, and he's never seen a woman. His mother died in childbirth. His father comes from a kind of line of people who raised their children to be misogynists. They have, instead of the chivalric code, they have this code that involves just a lot of really mean-spirited things about why women shouldn't be allowed there. And so this boy is growing up, and his father goes away and comes home and brings home a stepmother for him. And then his life kind of changes. And we were thinking about, the book begins with Arturo telling you his name and where his name comes from, and how powerful that is in storytelling. And yet, from the very beginning, he's slightly wrong about his name.
Yeah.
The basis of his name is wrong. And so students wrote poems in the class about their names.
Yeah.
And this is a fiction class, fiction reading seminar, and they just killed it. They wrote some really great things right away. And I was thinking about that while you're reading your poems, that every poem is in some ways like a different, instead, you could say this is about identity, but this is like a bigger definition of you.
I mean, I feel like naming is so important. I have a similar assignment where I have students investigate the history of their names. I thought about that a lot in your book when you talk about the chapter on police, right? What I really appreciate is that is one of the only riffs in the book where you really name things.
Yeah, you have to.
But you don't have to.
Yeah.
You prioritize that.
Well, I just feel like, given how many people lost their lives to, forms of sadism, the least you can do is give them their names.
Because what's in the name of, Tamir Rice? What's in the name of Trayvon Martin? What's in that name?
It's a world it's a life, it's everything, but it's also now, it's a container for all the grief and sorrow that their family feels. And I feel like abstracting a name like that takes that away from that takes that away from the ownership of the family.
I mean, and this is one of the only chapters where you do it.
Yeah. I couldn't write that chapter. I wanted this book to be both abstract and specific.
Yeah.
That's what I was admiring about your question poem. Is like it's both specific and collective, which is really hard to do. The only time I've ever seen it done quite at that level is Julie Otsuka's The Buddha. The Buddha in the Attic, which is about mail-order Japanese brides coming to California interwar period. And it begins on the boat. We were mostly virgins. We had long dark hair, and some of us wore dresses. And then it just is off, and you get these really specific things, and it's lyrical. And I think you can do that, especially when, to some degree, the text is writing towards people. That poem's directed, And as a listener, it's different, like as a white man listening to it versus whether I was a black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm overhearing this, and it's telling me things, but you're directing the speech at black women, I think.
Yeah.
But I think a poem like that can work on multiple levels.
Yeah. And I think that poem partially originated from seeing that ad on the train. And also, I lost my cousin Chris to some violence in my community. And what struck me about his part in the newspaper was that he got 4 lines. And none of them mentioned his name, right? So it was victim. It was suspect. He was identified, right? But none of it was his name. And I just thought about how even the language of his death was reductive.
Well, I'm sure you've seen those pictures where it's like a famous person with unnamed companion.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see those even now, like in People magazine. Like I was at the dentist, I was like, oh, People, it's 2019.
Yeah.
Like not that it was cool before, but like, and I think names are really important.
Yeah.
And I read this biography recently for review, is a Frank Lloyd Wright biography, who had quite a life, a really tragic period. I mean, he was not a super nice guy. Let's just put it out there.
I don't know much about him.
Well, he had 5 children with his first wife. They were married, I don't know, about 20 years, but at some point he fell in love with one of her friends, and they had an open affair that their partners knew about, and then eventually they ran off together to Paris, and he sort of blew up his like architectural career and all of his family life and everything to go after love. And he doesn't, like, you think of Frank Lloyd Wright and you don't think wild, passionate, crazy man who's like, I'm gonna drink deep from the nectar of love. But he
eroticism.
Yeah.
Frank Lloyd Wright, everybody.
I guess like some of those Falling Water is a pretty erotic house.
No, it's true.
But anyway, he came back, and then his wife was waiting for him, and she was fielding reporters saying like, he's going to come to his senses. He's going to come to his senses, and then at some point, he didn't, and he had been like, I think he was secretly simultaneously building this sort of Valhalla like house in Wisconsin. Then he moved into it with this woman he'd been having the affair with, and started a whole new life like right away. Had his like workshop start up there, and then at some point, one day he got a telegram. He was in Chicago, and one of the workers, this guy named Julian Carter, for some reason murdered 8 people with an axe, lit them on fire, and burned down the house, including the woman he had sort of fallen in love with and sort of changed his life for, and her own child. And this starts the book.
Oh, that's just the beginning?
That's the beginning of the biography. And sorry, it's a slightly long story, but the thing I really love about this biography is it spends over 100 pages researching the life of the guy who committed these crimes. And it had been reported in real time because Frank Lloyd Wright was so famous at the time. And yet they got all kinds of things about him wrong. He was supposedly from Antigua or the Caribbean. Not true. He grew up in Alabama. He worked at a hotel in Alabama. He had a very traceable life, but for some reason, it was not sort of.
Somebody didn't do their research.
No, and these were reporters who were like rode the train from Chicago up to Wisconsin with Wright while his house was on fire, but they couldn't take a train down to Alabama and find the suspect's family.
Yeah. And
he starved himself to death in the jail too, which seems like an incredibly potent way to die. And I don't know. This is slightly getting off topic, but I think within mythologies, and within a name it's not just the famous name.
Yes.
It's like all these other names.
It's your legacy. I mean, sometimes it's like what you're built off of. Like when you're named after someone, or when.
Is it to I know we just met, but is it too much to say? Like, how did you get your name?
Well, I was adopted. My mother's name is Christine, and so Krysten is just a variation of Christine. And then my middle name is Sophia, and that's my grandmother's name. So I feel like I'm carrying on the tradition of what that is.
But Krysten with a Y, I've not seen that often.
Yeah, my mama named me funny, is what I always say. She named me right. She named me correctly, but she wanted some variation of Krysten to keep it unique. I don't know. It's strange. But yeah.
I was named after two uncles, John David, and which was kind of screwed up because my uncle John burned a Bible, left town and turned up in Hollywood and ran a projector at a Blue movie theater, and then changed his name to Stephen Gates, which makes me think he was in porn. But
he had a mustache and everything.
He did have a mustache, and he spoke in the third person. He came to visit us in California when I was growing up in Sacramento, and I was 10. I was looking at him like, whoa, who's this guy? My uncle I never met before. And he said, Uncle Steve's going to make a sandwich. And I thought, Nephew John is fascinated.
In terms of this book, it seems like you're really invested in research and your sources. You really don't name a lot of sources.
No.
In this text.
No, because I wanted there to be as little barrier as possible.
Yeah.
You know, like we've kind of done a cul-de-sac on lineage, and I think lineage is fascinating. But in terms of storytelling, one of the things that's such a drag about the Bible is the opening is like, okay, I get it. Like there's some begatting happened. Let's just begat our way out of this section now, right? And creation myths can be so colorful, and we were talking backstage about various creation myths, and I think, you know, that's one area as an editor I would have sat down whoever wrote the Bible and be like, okay,
no more beginning.
You know, I think we can take this out on the market, but you're gonna have to do some revisions to the opening. You know, like we want to begin a mise-en-scene opening, none of this prelude stuff. Like take us right when the flood happens, like, and then we can go back and fill in backstory.
Give me the action. Start with the action. Start with the actual action.
But I also think in nonfiction, you know, this isn't really a sourced book, as in I'm not sort of we were talking about Walt Whitman, and Whitman is I don't know, it's kind of, I always feel he's around and in the air, you know, like some other American writers, actually like Emily Dickinson or Toni Morrison.
Absolutely.
I was in Spain when Toni Morrison died, and within like an hour, this Basque bookstore had set up a kind of shrine in their window. Yeah. And I think, what Spanish writer would die? You know, what other writer in the world would die? That around the world, within an hour, there would be kind of tributes and sections of a store curated. And I think basically for this book, I didn't want to have the reader tripping over things, and I also am totally aware I'm not like Walt Whitman or Toni Morrison, so I didn't need to.
But there's a lot of things in conversation. Like you have a lot of we's, like the collective of the we.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate. I mean, and that reminded me. Like I teach the preface of Leaves of Grass.
Yeah.
Because of its collective, like, here's what we shall do. Right. That very end of the preface. Like I feel like that's really important to me.
Well, and it's in the we the people, you know, and I think this simultaneous erosion of we that has come from the occlusions that a so-called liberal we involved that were hurtful to so many people, that lots of other people dropped out of that we, as they should have. You know, you look at Teju Cole's Twitter feed and it says "we who." Exactly. And I totally agree with him. It's like you have to be careful when you use a we, because you're making assumptions. And
Absolutely.
so I was very aware that when I was using we, I was trying to use it in collectives where it made sense rather than dropped people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I saw that. And we're going to open it up to questions just in case y'all want to add to this conversation. What y'all got? What y'all thinking about? Anything? any conversations that are coming up as y'all have been listening? What's up?
How much of the inspiration of this, it seems like there's political inspiration to it, there's the moment, but it also seems like it's very personal for you, despite the sort of dropping away of some of the personal words. So how much of it for you in the moment of starting this project was the inspiration personal, and how much did it feel like you wanted to sort of gesture toward how we can change things now?
I don't know. That's a good question. It's not personal as in it has to do with my intimate private life, but it is deeply personal because it's about things I care about so much. It was driving me insane to watch them flagrantly abused in all forms of public life.
Yeah.
And it was intolerable for me to not do something with the one thing I'm good at or even remotely capable of doing. You know, I can't fly a kite. I would not be like a good railroad engineer. Like, I would be terrible in the apocalypse. I would be like, let me read you a poem. But I could try to like unravel some thoughts based on words, you know. And I just found that there was this constant like interaction in public, especially in the news, about redefining things.
Yeah.
And of course, in the middle of this kind of constitutional crisis we're in, we have to have things defined because we've never really known what emoluments were. Mm-hmm. And then in the middle of that, there's this redefinition, like, well, you know, actually taking a lease of a government building and calling it a hotel after yourself and then having people stay there who are from other governments is not an emolument. It's just simple good business sense. And so the crazy thing about the time we're living in is that true definitions of words in governmental sense can be flagrantly
Changed,
yes.
I mean, like, my aunt works for the EPA, and I feel like a lot of the definitions of the work she does has changed.
Oh God, what does she do there?
I mean, I want to get my aunt in trouble.
They had the best fake Twitter feed. Remember that, like the alternate EPA. But under the Bush administration, you started seeing like the Clean Airs Act, which basically allowed companies to pollute more.
Yeah.
And this Orwellian use of language, I think, it's definitional twister, because every time a word is defined in public, then someone can just say no, it doesn't mean that.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Not because we're in the reality creation business.
Yeah, and I think that's been the hardest part for her in her job. Is like redefining her position as a government employee who's also been so invested in doing the work that she's been doing. It's like her title has changed.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
This is why personally I think more people are reading poems.
Yeah.
Because a poem can it defines its own universe. Like, you cannot disagree with it once it's strong enough. And it creates a space in which you can live that's bigger than a word sometimes.
You can make a choice. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you both. I've never encountered your poetry before, and it was a real joy to listen to it. Joy. I'm using joy in a different way.
That's awesome.
And I guess I've been thinking a lot about propaganda, or just a little bit. And as soon as I come across John, this new work of yours, I think of it. It's like obviously right there, but in a way not. And when you think about, what propaganda, how it's used, is it takes both, basically power takes the language of democracy and uses it for its own ends. And so I guess my question is, how can we, what is the democratic movement around language? Like, how do we agree on restoring, say, meaning? Because when you think about, like, that effort, it's so often abused in terms of the difference between, like, prescriptivists and descriptivists, to get, like, fancy about it, right? It's like, do you describe the way language is used, or do you say this is how language is used? So when you say this is how language is used, it creates this, like, unease. It's like who is we and how do we decide? And I would say maybe very simply, like I was thinking about my daughter. There is a question here. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and we are constantly reinforcing to her that she says, like all the time in all of her interactions, my body, my rules.
Yeah.
That's what we're teaching her.
Consent.
My partner. My body, my rules.
Mm.
And it's so different from the way I was raised, and it's so different from my, like, the way she's treated by, like, my parents. It drives me nuts. Like, I don't even want her around them for this reason.
Mm.
So, can we come up with another application that we can leave with tonight about how we're going to speak or be a body in a public space that is in the spirit of what you both shared?
Y'all, can I just say the power of listening is so important to the way we just listen to other people's experiences and look at the work they've already been doing in their bodies. And I think about this as a Black woman a lot, and how people are just not willing to listen to my definitions of things and trust that that definition is informed by something, right? But the idea of just holding space for anyone to talk about definitions, I think, is important. Does that make sense? Like, I'm so exhausted in this Black body sometimes because I feel like I have to reinforce my safety in the way that I define what boundaries mean for me. But it shouldn't be that way. So much could be solved with people just simply listening to other people's definitions.
That's a really beautiful and concise way to say almost everything that needs to be said to that. You know, my hope with this book was to create space for conversations about definitions, not to sort of, you know, be like some sort of one-man Politburo, be like, this is this, or like, you know, De Niro and the Deer Hunter. This is this. Never understood what that actually meant. But more to create a space where, you know, half of this book is interrogative. It's asking questions rather than giving. And I think a definition should be made up of a lot of questions.
Yeah, questions.
You know, and the response to questions is sometimes silence and listening.
Mm-hmm. So if that was my added lexicon, I would add silence to that lexicon. Because so much is damaged with silence, but so much can be added by silence. It's like a relationship. I don't know. Yeah.
Krysten, when you brought up James Baldwin,
Yeah.
and you were talking about discovering his work, even though you're familiar with so much of it, but like when you find something new, when you're shown something new, that feeling, and you use the word timeless.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about John, I think early on opened things up, talking about how like the moment that we're living in was, you know, what these chapters of these risks were born from. And I'm just wondering for both of you, when you encounter something from the past, which, you know, that can mean yesterday or 30 years or 100 years ago, and you feel like you almost like find this time capsule of a certain language or a voice or a spirit, how does that inform your own creative process? Like, do you feel like... I'll just stop there with that. As
Oh my gosh. And I think spirit is a really good way of saying that. Like, today when I was rereading your book to get ready for this, I brought it, Sister Outsider, Audre Lorde,
Yeah,
because,
just copy that.
yeah, like there's the chapter in it about the uses of anger. And so, like, that's always, like, her spirit was so much in conversation with just my conversation with your book as I was preparing. Like, uses of anger. Like, how do we use our anger? And how do we use that to, like, perpetuate honesty? For better or for worse? I don't know.
She's amazing. I love that she's such a fantastically necessary writer about anger, but also about love.
Oh, yeah.
And that you can be the two of those things
Yeah.
at the same time.
But nobody was giving her credit for that at the time.
Yeah. I think I also think Adrienne Rich was the same way.
Yeah,
That she
absolutely.
wanted people to read her love poems
Absolutely.
as much as they read her 1970s oracular, early feminist work. But I guess I'm a huge fan of Baldwin too.
Yeah.
I moved to New York in 1996 and discovered Giovanni's Room at a used bookstore, and was living with two of my roommates from university. And we lived in Giovanni's Room.
Yeah.
All of us read it. All of us were straight, yet we sometimes shared beds together, and we would go out to clubs and we'd get bored and we'd say like, this party sucks. Let's go back to Giovanni's Room. And we didn't realize like we were sort of, living our way into like the like probably the gateway to one of the greatest sort of explosions of bisexual writing.
Yeah.
Because it's a novel about bisexuality, not about homosexuality.
Yeah.
And Baldwin, from that point on, to me, was one of those writers that gave you just an immense amount of unjudgmental freedom.
Yeah.
It's almost godlike regard that you are accepted in the house of his books, no matter what.
No matter what you come to.
Yeah, and that acceptance, I think, just I'm not making. I don't know. Stephen Miller might burst into flames, but I think in general that kind of acceptance it sort of denatures or diffuses a lot of hatred. And so, for me, when I pick up old writers, I'm attuned to the writers who have that kind of immense. Colette is this way too. You go into one of her books and you're like, how is this a book from 1904?
Yeah, it's timeless.
It's timeless, and that I wanted. I don't sit there being like, I will write a timeless essay today, but I think those qualities of timelessness are really it's a vitality and an openness of spirit.
Sometimes it's like, what have we learned? Like from Baldwin till now, why, and from Audrey until now, like why are we still repeating the cycle? Like they're reminding us of the work we still need to do.
Yeah, it's sad too because Baldwin, he would be an old man today, but he could still technically, theoretically.
Yeah.
It's not like he'd be 124. He'd be like, I don't know if he would even be 90.
Yeah.
And same with Audre Lorde. We some of the writers, that are no longer with us could still be with us, and then these endless old fucks live forever.
Forever and ever and ever. And they just keep going.
What do you make of? I mean, sometimes as a teacher, I feel despair when I realize that the only way that certain lessons like that Audre Lorde might have can be taught is if there's a new person who is as exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, Audre Lorde is, thank God, kind of back, but she was ignored a lot during her lifetime.
Yeah.
And I wonder, that cycle of forgetting seems
scary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Morrison's the same way. I know we just lost her, but I'm like afraid that we're gonna lose her. I don't know how to say it.
I taught Tar Baby.
Yeah.
Recently at NYU, and that was such a great class because has anybody read that book recently?
Nope.
It's such a wild book.
Yeah.
It's like you start it and it feels like a commercial novel, and then it's a creolized Caribbean novel that's interacting with ideas of the American South. And it's also an extremely theatrical novel. It's one of the best dinner party novels ever because it's basically one long dinner party. And it's amazing on sex. And it has so much to it because you think, oh, okay, I've got in my head what this book is. And then it just opens up a whole other container.
Mm-hmm.
And she just has she had so many gears, and the dialogue, she has this like almost theatrical dialogue. And then she would there's this section that's 2 pages when the main characters kind of split. They're like, this family sucks. Let's get out of here. They go to New York, and then this character is looking at women on the street, black women on the street in New York. And this is description of black women walking down the street in New York in 1978. And it is just like a song. It is so energetic and full of love and powerful and funny.
She's a poet.
Yes.
forever.
She could have been probably the best American poet, but just decided to use whole paragraphs.
Any last questions? No, I love it. Getting sentimental about Morrison.
What's your favorite book by her?
I just finished Beloved again for my 7th time. I had a feeling that she was going to pass away. And this summer, I just read everything again. And I finished Beloved again. It took me a month to read Beloved. Where when I teach it, it takes 3 weeks, you know.
God.
Or a week and a half. It took me a month. I don't know. I think that just speaks to the way I love that novel. I also love The Bluest Eye.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first sentence of Beloved might be one of the best ever. About the house. Oh.
Just being spiteful.
Yes.
I love it.
Spite was like, you could create a B-side to this book and have all the, like the Halloween version, like the After Dark, like spite, regret, shame, you know. Because spite feels like it's in the air lately. But I'd rather like lean into words that are, not lean in, but I'd rather like think about words that are
collective.
Yeah.
How we're in this together.
Yeah.
Thank y'all for being here.
Thanks for coming.